Think about where our country stands right now on the topic of capital punishment. It's been a persistently hot topic between brethren, between people of the world, when brought up in different types of discussions for a lot of folks for many decades now. And we're definitely a divided nation when it comes to the overall stance of if we should be in favor of it or if we should stand against it. A lot of states have lately been getting away from the use of capital punishment, of executing the death penalty upon individuals when they do that which is against the law. Currently, there are only 31 states that have it enacted and have currently used it within the last 25 years even. But in the mid-1990s was really when it had its strongest surge. In 1992, the death penalty had an 80% approval rating. And ever since that point, when it was at that peak, it's been trending downward. But this past year, in 2018, something very intriguing happened, where we see the approval rating for something as this topic, as it's been consistently dropping over the last 20 plus years, it spiked by 13% in approval rating. Why? Why would that happen? Why would that take place? Is it perhaps because society as a whole is tired of living in an unrighteous generation, tired of the amount of crimes that go on and are unpunished? We live in a state here in Texas that has executed the most criminals by the death penalty. Since 1923, we have sent thousands of folks down to Huntsville, Texas, and they definitely don't live much longer after that. This is definitely a state that we live in in our localities where we are definitely for capital punishment. We are pro the use of it. But tonight, are we just going to be okay with society's view on it? That they say that since it is legalized, that since it is in action here in this state, is it okay for us to just agree with that? Or might we want to take a little bit more time and consider what God says, what the Bible says on a hot topic such as this, on the use of capital punishment as He ordained it? And as we look, we'll see that throughout His Word, He used capital punishment, but for a specific purpose. The purpose of establishing His justice, of establishing His righteousness as these characteristics of His own, that He is just, that He is right. And this is a tool that He uses to make that seen for all mankind. But why? Why is capital punishment just, is our question tonight. Capital punishment is just because God demanded the death penalty for those who take the life of someone who's made in the image of God. What does the term capital punishment mean? Think about that term that we use. The word capital comes from the Latin root capit or capita. It can be either, which means head. And the phrase of capital punishment literally means to take one's head off, to remove it from the person. And so we're looking at the most severe punishment that can be ushered out for someone for a crime that they commit. We're taking their lives. Their lives are over because of the actions that they chose to partake in. This is the most serious punishment, and God established it as such to be observed by us. But what makes capital punishment, this practice, what makes it just? What makes it something that shows God's righteousness? God required it. In Genesis, the 9th chapter, read with me here. In Genesis 9, beginning in verse 5, it says here, "Surely your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man, from the hand of every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God He made man. God required the blood of His creation, that which He made Himself by speaking into existence man in the very beginning. He desires that blood, that when it is shed, to be avenged. God's justice has always been seen since the beginning of time in creation. Here, after Noah and his family, they're the only ones left on earth. God makes this very covenant with him to establish this principle. After the world has been flooded, there's no one left. And here God is giving this covenant, demanding His justice. Justice was demanded for man that is killed because he's made in the image of God. And there's nothing that we as people could do to remedy that situation. There's no amount of money or physical compensation that could fix that debt, that could remedy that situation, but only by blood. Why? Why is it that way? Because we as humans, we don't have the capability to replace that spirit that is within someone, because God placed it in there. And when someone does die, the spirit returns to God who gave it. We cannot fix that. And God says that this is justice. This is what is right. This is a righteous situation that He has given approval of. From the hand of every beast, as the text says. God makes a distinction between animal and between man. We know animals are not made in the image of God. Therefore, it is okay to kill animals. But it's not okay to kill an innocent person, an innocent man. That's the difference here. And God says that blood is demanded as a payment for the killing of someone who is innocent. This is what God says is justice. He establishes it in this way. And who was it that was to be the avenger of blood? The text says it was the family of that victim. They are the ones to go and pursue justice, to make sure that it is carried out. They're the ones that feel the grief of losing a family member. And God allows them to avenge their fallen loved one. Punishment of death was not only given as punishment for murder, though, in the old times. In the law of Moses, did you know that each of the 10 commandments, we have an instance where they were broken individually? And the punishment for breaking each one of those laws resulted in the death of the perpetrator. The first and second commandment of serving other gods, failing to remain faithful to God in Deuteronomy 13 and in verse 6 through 17, we see people executed. The third commandment of taking the name of the Lord in vain, of using His name without respect and reverence for His name, for all that God is, you will be killed for that as well in Leviticus 24. The fourth commandment of failing to observe the Sabbath day, as we see in Exodus 35 and Numbers 15. The fifth commandment of dishonoring parents and going against the instruction that they provide to their children, as Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 21 provide. The sixth commandment of killing someone who is innocent, taking innocent life, as Exodus 21 and Numbers 35 reveal. We'll spend some time looking at that in a moment. The seventh commandment of not to commit adultery, a failure to remain faithful to one's spouse. God condemns that, and He says death is the equal punishment in Leviticus 20. The eighth commandment of not to steal someone else's belongings in Exodus 22. The ninth commandment of bearing false witness against someone else in Deuteronomy 19. And then finally, the 10th commandment of coveting that which is not yours. Coveting after someone else's belongings, as we see with Achan in Joshua chapter 7. What would our society look like if we took a similar stance as they did in the law of Moses, as God did in that time, and we executed people when they committed these crimes, these trespasses? If your child was rebellious, as some children were back then, In Deuteronomy 21, you were to bring them before the whole congregation and you were to stone them for their disobedience, for their unruliness to your rule. We might have a lot more children of the world that were obedient to parents. And the ones that weren't, well, they wouldn't be around anymore. What about those who take the name of the Lord in vain? Leviticus 24, we see that those who blasphemed and took the name of the Lord in vain, they were stoned as well. What would people do today if they were in a situation where when they're frustrated and they are upset and they can't take God's name in vain? It seems like every day when you're listening to the radio, you hear people saying, OMG. What would they do if they were executed for that? If we as Christians didn't have to sit through that kind of language all around us all the time, it'd be pretty great. And as often as we hear them talk in that manner, some folks, they might be worthy of death multiple times in a sentence even. But what's most important about this, and a really good lesson to see, is that where man has hesitated with his judgment regarding something that is sinful, God does not. Read with me in Numbers 15. Look at the account that we have recorded for us here. In Numbers 15, beginning in verse 32. Here we have a man who has been collecting sticks on the Sabbath, and we pick up in verse 33. As they have found him, in verse 33 it says, "And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron, and to all the congregation. They put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'The man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp.' So as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died." God's justice is going to be shown against ungodliness, even that which we might not think is that bad in our minds, like breaking the Sabbath. How often do we see people today try and justify a type of crime in the world? They claim that it has good motives behind it. They might have made similar arguments for this man. He's out here, he's collecting sticks on the Sabbath day. He has to provide for his household. He has to have a fire. He has to be able to cook for his family. It doesn't matter in God's eyes. It's still sin. It's breaking the law that he gave, that he established. And it doesn't matter because his disobedience has gotten him killed. And notice that even when Moses and Aaron do not know what to do, God has the answer. God knows how to deal with this situation. The ends do not justify the means. No matter what good cause our society may try and justify the crimes that they tend to look past today, God's justice is going to be shown against them at all times. He will always punish those who fail to live unto His will. And are people being put to death for their sins is just one way that God's punishment upon them is seen, is manifested. But notice also that capital punishment is just because He punishes the guilty while preserving the innocent. In Exodus, the 20th chapter, and in verse 13, as Moses is receiving the 10 Commandments, if you're reading out of the King James Version, it's a very short verse, but that 6th commandment will read, "Thou shalt not kill." Well, all right. That's a pretty short case study for us today. If we're not supposed to kill, if that's God's commandment on this, then why are we looking at capital punishment? We can't kill, we can't put people to death, so we don't need to look at this any further. Well, hold on a second. Is this really God? Is this command really God? Is this command God prohibiting capital punishment? Prohibiting putting to death a trespasser who has broken His law? You see, different translations have it rendered there as murder, even. And so we might ask the difference. What's the difference between murder and between killing? What's the difference in those two terms? They both involve taking of life, but yet there are still two distinct characteristics that make them separate. The first is premeditation. Read with me in Exodus 21, beginning in verse 12. It says here, "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die." Premeditation, that acting on a malicious spirit, understanding that I have something against you and I'm going to kill you for it. Those feelings that we then allow to translate into action to where we take the life of another individual, that is one thing that constitutes murder. But there's another one as well. The second condition is the condition of the one who's being killed. You see, the innocence of the victim is what determines one's life as being killed or being murdered. And this is why God required blood to be taken by family members in Genesis 9. This is what the difference that made Cain a murderer versus Cain a killer when he killed his brother Abel. And this is important to understand because capital punishment was an extremely important institution in the Old Testament. And if we're to say, "Thou shalt not kill," then everything that we have in this book is wrong, is not true. You cannot stop the spreading of sinful behavior, but you can demonstrate a force and justice to combat ungodly action. It's been said before that if you have a bunch of dogs all together and one of them has fleas, pretty soon they're all going to have fleas. And the same thing works with sin. When there's a society of people together and they typically will all begin acting in the same way, participating in the same actions, unless it is stopped, unless it is remedied. Imagine if Korah, after he led that rebellion against the leaders of Israel, imagine if he had been permitted to live. We don't know what would have happened, and this may be an assumption, but is it possible that he could have tried to rise up again? Certainly. But God put him to death. God shows his force, shows his power there, that he's not going to stand for that kind of ungodliness. In Deuteronomy 17, it talks about a time when you are with your brother, and if he comes to you privately to encourage you to go and worship other gods, that you are to stand firm against him. You see, men may know something is wrong and sinful, yet they continuously pry and try to persuade those around them to engage in these sinful activities along with them. But that doesn't make it right. The death penalty was and is important today because it establishes God's righteousness against the actions that do not please him. But think about those cities of refuge. We read a little bit in Exodus 12 and in verse 13, it mentions there that they may flee. Where are they fleeing to? Well, it'd be the cities of refuge. Cities of refuge were to ensure that there would be a trial for all crimes, but especially for ones that involve taking of a life. Any time that you killed someone, whether it was an accident or whether it was intentional, you were directed to go to these cities of refuge immediately, to not wait, to not hesitate. Well, you might say, how do you accidentally kill someone? Deuteronomy 19 presents a case where if you and someone else are going into the woods to retrieve some wood and you have an axe and you're swinging away and that axe head comes off and it fatally wounds the person that you're with, that's an accident. You're not at fault. You didn't intentionally premeditate to kill them, but you killed them still. And who might be upset at that? Their family. So what do? You have to flee to the cities of refuge so that you may preserve your own life, so that you're not killed by that avenger of blood. And this situation, that's not something that would have happened every day, was it? But yet it's an example that there were times when you killed someone accidentally and you had to flee to these cities of refuge. And what's really neat is to see that these cities, these three cities, were placed strategically throughout the kingdom of Israel. One in the north, one in the central area, and then one on the south. Why? Why would that be? Because when you did kill someone, whether premeditated or whether an accident, you needed to get there as soon as you could to preserve your own life, so that you're not dying. You have to get there quickly. Time is of the essence in these times. And these cities were established for a certain purpose, to preserve the life of that person until they could till they could make it to trial. And then they would stand before the congregation and they would determine the essence of the case, whether you murdered them or whether it was an unintentional killing. And God gave specific criteria of what would be determined as murder and what would be determined as killing. In Numbers, the 35th chapter, and in verse 16, let's read a couple of these cases that he explains and gives instruction for and classification, really. In Numbers 35 and verse 16, it says here, "But if he strikes him with an iron implement so that he dies, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he strikes him with a stone in the hand, by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. And the murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he strikes him with a wooden hand weapon, by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. And the murderer shall surely be put to death. The avenger of blood himself shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. He shall put him to death. If he punishes him out of hatred, or while lying in wait, hurls something at him so that he dies, or in enmity strikes him with his hand so that he dies, the one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him." These times, notice God gives criteria. God does not leave it up to men's interpretation to determine what was killing and what was murder. He has decided what each one was. It was never left up to men in their own mind to make a judgment call like this as a weighty matter. And in verses 29 and 32, it talks about how you needed to have multiple witnesses to testify to the crime, to say what really happened, because men's word is not ever good enough. It's never truly good when it's only just one person. We see how dishonest our society is today. And they had to follow it. They had to follow God's righteousness in this case. And it's shown by him giving a template of how they were to carry out and make their way through these kind of situations that would be frustrating. But notice, capital punishment is also just, even when it might not be a deterrent at crimes. But yet there are times when it's been used as a deterrent to unlawful actions, and it works. Notice in Genesis 26 and in verse 11, here Isaac has brought about a very similar situation from example of his father, of telling the king Abimelech and his subjects that his wife Rebekah is actually his sister. And in Genesis 26, beginning in verse 10, "As it's been found out that she is truly his wife, not his sister, and this half-truth was not real," in verse 10, Abimelech said, "What is this that you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us." So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Isaac, by creating this situation, he's put himself and Rebekah in a very tough spot. They're off in a foreign land, and by giving out this information that Rebekah's not married because she's his sister, you could see how the men in that town, they might become frustrated thinking that she was able to be married. Even they had respect to not enter into an adulterous relationship. These Gentiles, they understood that. That's powerful. So what does Abimelech do? He saves Isaac and Rebekah's lives by doing this. He threatens punishment of death to anyone who would touch Isaac or his wife. And Abimelech, using this fear of death, we see the result that it had. We know that Isaac and Rebekah remained there another year, and they prospered. They grew. What is one of the main arguments that people may have for the death penalty today that say that it doesn't work? They say it doesn't really deter crime. And our government, they take the stance that it does deter crime, that it is good in that manner. The majority of states that have it approved. In 1985, in Spain, rape was an epidemic. And a local governor, interestingly enough, in that time, he took action that really stands out and shows that capital punishment is a deterrent. You see, there was two men who were found attacking a woman brutally. And they brought these two men, to this governor, and he takes them to the open town square. And there, he has them strangled for all to see. And what might happen the next 6 months? Well, the amount of rapes that occurred plummeted. There was not hardly any anymore. I read one somewhere in an article that said most murders are out of passion or during drunkenness, where the consequences are never considered. So the death penalty is not even thought of. But what if capital punishment does in fact stop just one murder? Some murderers have to plan and observe and stalk after their potential victim for years. They take the time out of their lives to make those preparations for killing someone. And these types of cases, they offer plenty of time to consider the consequences for their actions and what it might actually hold for them. In 1977, in Tempe, Arizona, a 13-year-old girl named Christy Fornoff was kidnapped and assaulted while she was on her newspaper route. The person who abducted her, who took her, was a maintenance man at her apartment building. You see, he had been watching her for years. He had known her. He had talked to her. And then one day he finally took action. He killed that little girl. He left her body in a dumpster for a few days before she was found. But after he was caught and interviewed, found out what really happened. He had her in his apartment for 10 days before he ended up taking her life. And he explains his reasoning, because he said he was almost at the point where he was going to let her go. But then he remembered he didn't have to fear being put to death, because Arizona did not have capital punishment legalized for another 15 years after this incident. He knew that he didn't have to fear being executed for this horrendous crime that he was going to carry out. And it could have deterred this crime. It could have deterred this instance with this little girl. She might be alive today even. But although capital punishment can deter some crime, its real purpose is to establish God's wrath against ungodliness. Read with me in Romans, the 1st chapter, and in verse 28, what the Apostle Paul says on this. To the church at Rome, he says in Romans 1, and beginning in verse 28, as he's writing this letter, he's talking to the Gentiles specifically in this text. And in verse 28 he says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, and strife," and the sins go on, keep piling on. And he's listing these practices that the Gentiles engaged in. But notice what he says in verse 32. "Who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are what? Are deserving of death. Not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them." The Gentiles knew and recognized within themselves that there was penalties for their actions, that the things that they were engaging in was sinful, and that it would cost them their lives, that it was against what God Almighty had ordained for them to live in. They knew that they could face death for what they were doing specifically, but yet they still chose to go and act in this very manner anyway. You see, some people think a lot like this today. They hold to this line of thinking. They do not care what the punishment will be for their crimes. They're going to do them anyway. They want revenge when they feel wronged. They want to get back at whoever it was that wronged them, and yeah, they may kill them. They want to do whatever they want to. They don't want to feel restrained or controlled by a government, by authorities that are over us. They don't care what the consequences will be for their actions. But yet, it can still deter crime. Even if it means being put to death, they don't care about the consequences sometimes, the people of the world. But what is the purpose of punishment? The purpose of punishment is to actually punish the person who committed wrongful actions. Capital punishment is not designed to deter others for crime. If it carries out that purpose and redirects people who may have been contemplating taking place in these wrong actions, then great. That's awesome. But its purpose is to show God's justice by executing ungodly men, ungodly women who detest God and live in a manner that is not pleasing unto Him. Capital punishment is also just because He demands that the government apply the death penalty. Notice in 1 Peter 2 and in verse 13, the text reads here, "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to the governors, as to those who are sent by him for punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." We are to be subject to our government, to the authorities that have been put in place above us. And this rule applies to every aspect of our lives, to all the laws that they may establish, as long as they do not contradict or go against God's will Himself. But why do we submit to the government for the Lord's sake? It's because we as Christians, we are to be upholding a standard. And if we are seen as being unruly or not subject to that which they have established, that's not really showing the attitude of a Christian, is it? We are to be subject to them because God is the one that's established them in power. God is the one that has let them escalate to this point where they have the capabilities in themselves to create laws, to put them in place, to protect and serve the people of this nation. And He establishes rulers and governments who use capital punishment. Yes, He does. And that's good because His righteousness is manifested in cruel people being executed. Notice in Acts the 25th chapter and in verse 10, the respect that Paul had for the government. In Acts 25 and in verse 10, it says here, "So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar." In this text, Paul is appealing to Caesar before he's put on trial. And his main statement throughout this chapter is that if I did anything worth dying for, worth death, capital punishment, I am willing to die. I'm willing to abide in the government's decision to put me to death. I'm willing to be subject to that. Why? Well, he's confident in the first part that he has done nothing deserving of death. The Jews have been after him. They're trying to put him to death, and now he's in a Gentile court. He's about to be brought before Caesar. He's before these local governors at this point. But he also respects the government's power to kill him if they saw it fit. And he would be fine with that. He would be subject to that. But the reason he's going through this and jumping over all these hurdles in the first place is because he doesn't want to die. He wants to preserve his life naturally. But he recognizes that the Roman government had the right and power to take away his life if they saw fit. And so we see Paul appealing on this very basis with this understanding. And might I suggest that we need to have this mind about us in terms of our relationship to the government that is over us today. If we commit a heinous crime that is against their laws, that they determine is worthy of death, we should be subject to that. We should be willing to be put to death if we commit a crime that is of that nature. And that sentence will be fairly placed upon us if they see fit. How do we know that? How do we know that they are truly from God, that they're truly appointed by Him for His carrying out of His justice? Well, look in Romans 13, beginning in verse 1. The Apostle Paul records in this letter to the Romans, he says here, "Let every soul be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." Notice verse 3. "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil." Paul speaks of the importance of the government being able to carry out justice, being able to carry out and punish people for their disobedience to the law. Bears not the sword in vain. Capital punishment is right with God because He uses it. He has established it in that way. But what does it mean to bear the sword in vain? It means that their power, the authority that God has placed with them, is going to be used correctly and for good and for punishment of the wicked, for those deserving of it, even if it means by death. Our law officials that we have present today, they're not out here hunting good citizens. They stand at opposition with those who do not abide under the law and under the principles that they have established. That is who they are against. Those who do not do good according to the law. And isn't that a good illustration of our relationship with God? When we do what is right, when we abide according to His principles, we have nothing to worry about, do we? But when we cross that line and disobey blatantly what He says, then we're in trouble, aren't we? And He's not pleased with us. And He surely is ready to punish us today as well. But today, we don't simply obey the government because we don't want to die, do we? We do it because it's the right thing to do. Read verse 5 of Romans 13. "Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake." We respect our government and the officials that are placed there because it's the right thing to do. Our conscience that we have within ourselves, it's the knowledge that we have inside. Whatever it is that we determine with our conscience is established as either good or bad. And when we violate our conscience, we're engaging in something that is bad. And our conscience hurts us when we go against that which is right. And that's in play because we ought to fear government, because they are over us, not just because they can punish us. We see a lot of people today that say, especially in the religious world, when looking at capital punishment and things of this nature, but God loves us. Why would He have a government placed over us that's going to deal so harshly, that they're going to be putting people to death? That's not something that He would want. God's justice is shown through capital punishment. It's a tool that He uses to show and orchestrate His power and His displeasement against ungodly actions. That's the message here, folks. That's what we're looking at. Capital punishment is God's way of showing justice. And that's why it is just. But yet many Christians today make arguments time and time again against this practice and against civil government, and they do not respect it. And it's sad, because it's clearly here in God's inspired Word. God uses capital punishment, and the Bible clearly supports the role that government has in being over us, that they can establish laws that are put in place that we must be obedient under, even capital punishment. God uses capital punishment Himself. God required justice for the blood of innocent man that is shed. Because, why? Because they're made in His image. That's why. God uses justice to show His fair nature. He protects the innocent as well as condemning those that are murderers, that shed innocent blood in malice and in pent-up feelings. But He still protects the innocent. He gives them protection. He has established the death penalty to uphold His true character, to show us as the world and manifest that He is righteous, that He is good, that He is one who provides for His people. But not only this, but He continuously has supported the role of local government in this very matter. And it is something He established and requires that we abide peacefully and subjectively under our officials. Many Christians are simply misinformed or unaware that God has actually established our government to operate in this manner, to work in this form and fashion. But might I suggest to you that rather than being critical of our policemen and judges and their roles and the things that they are bringing out, that we teach our children respect for those that are placed over us. Look in Ecclesiastes, the 8th chapter, and in verse 11 as we close this evening. Notice what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 8 and in verse 11. It says here, beginning in verse 10, Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. And this also is vanity. Notice verse 11. Because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. When justice is not exemplified in society effectively, sin will run rampant. People become encouraged to do more wrong when they receive no punishment for their actions. Know this, that even when we have people that commit a sinful action that's clearly, blatantly against His will that He's given to us, and they get away with it, God will have His day of judgment. God will have His day of vengeance when His wrath that has been stored up against them for their ungodly deeds will be poured out on them. That's what's awaiting for them. His wrath is prepared for that very day. And we are to be subject to government that is over us, but we're also to be obedient to God first and foremost. Perhaps you're here today and you're not a Christian. You've not been obedient to the gospel's call. If you believe Jesus' words to be true and you are willing to confess that you believe Him to be the one and only Son of God, you can repent of your sins this very night if you believe that you want to commit your life to Christ, to a life that would be one of serving Him and directing your life to follow in His footsteps. Maybe you've already obeyed the gospel call, but have not been obedient to God in one way or another. You can repent of those very sins now as well. Come to the front if you need to be baptized and be saved tonight. Will you be obedient to His will? Come while we stand and while we sing.